Hello, this is Cindy McComas, and on behalf of the National Pollution Prevention Roundtable, welcome and thanks for joining this webinar as part of our Fall Safer Chemistry Challenge Program webinar series. I'm a co-project manager for the Safer Chemistry Challenge program, and I'm also an adjunct professor at the University of Minnesota. Our webinar today, entitled the Quick Chemical Assessment Tool, or QCAT, a hazard assessment tool for small and medium-sized businesses, will provide you with information on ways to help you advance your efforts towards safer chemistry. The QCAT tool was developed by Washington State Department of Ecology and is a simpler alternative to some other hazard assessment tools that require a high level of technical and resource commitments. QCAT was written to enable small and medium-sized businesses with limited resources and limited technical expertise to conduct a basic hazard assessment. It can also be used by technical assistance programs working with small and medium businesses on implementing safer chemistries. QCAT provides an introduction to the hazard assessment process and allows the identification of those chemicals with the highest levels of concern. So this webinar will help advance the goal of NPPR's Safer Chemistry Challenge program. That is to motivate, challenge, assist, and reward companies as you work to find safer alternatives to chemicals of concern to human health and the environment. As a unique partnership between industry, states, and nonprofits, this challenge program can accelerate opportunities for you to capture emerging markets for products with safer chemistries, turns your commitment to safer chemistry into an action plan. It can help promote supply chain strategies to help you achieve your safer chemistry goals. It can also provide access to resources such as technical assistance programs, webinars, and recognition programs. And it results in a cleaner environment while providing value to your company's bottom line. So this is the last webinar in our fall series, but we will keep you informed of the schedule for the upcoming spring 2013 webinar series. Before we start, we just have a few logistics to cover. During the webinar, all attendees will be on mute. If you have questions, please submit them through the Submit Question option in the toolbar that GoToWebinar provides. If there is time, questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. We would very much like to hear from you about how this webinar helps meet your company's program needs to move towards safer chemistries. So please do fill out the survey that you'll receive at the end of the webinar. So our speaker for today's webinar is Alex Stone from the Washington State Department of Ecology. Dr. Stone has a BS in chemistry from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, an MS in Environmental Engineering and Science from the University of Washington in Seattle, and a Doctor of Science degree in chemistry from the University of Oslo in Oslo, Norway. He has worked as a chemist for the Washington State Department of Ecology for the past 18 years. He currently functions as a safer chemical alternative chemist for the Hazardous Waste and Toxics Reduction Program. And he works on a number of green chemistry projects, green chemistry related projects, including Washington's Chemical Action Plan, an alternative assessment guidance document that he developed. He helps conduct safer chemical alternative assessments, and he serves as an advisor to Ecology on management on chemical policy and other chemistry-related issues. Now let's begin the webinar with Alex Stone on the Quick Chemical Assessment Tool, also known as QCAT. Alex?
Very good. Thank you very much. I appreciate inviting me to speak today. I am going to talk a little bit more than just the QCAT as well. I'm going to see if I can get the slides to advance. We seem to have tech. There we go. Okay. Sorry, I just had to figure out how to get the slides to advance. Anyway, the outline is I'm going to try to give this a little bit of background information about why companies care about toxic chemicals, how businesses have started to respond to it, and how the regulators looked at it, but then talk a little bit about regrettable substitutions and the whole idea. It's really the basis behind an alternative assessment. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the new tools and in more gory detail about QCAT. Now, I realize that the webinar is only an hour, and I want to leave some time for questions at the end. So I will probably try to go through the initial stuff rather quickly, but this webinar will be recorded, and you'll have the opportunity to hear it again. Plus, if you're interested, you can drop me a line or a note, because I've given several presentations on this topic, and all of them have been recorded. So I have 3 hours of presentations on QCAT and related topics that were just posted within the last month. So there's a lot more information out there. If you get really bored and you want to hear more of my voice, that's entirely possible. But this webinar also will be recorded and posted for your review in future. So why do companies care about toxic chemicals? Primarily because of rising consumer awareness of chemicals and their concerns. You know, the presence in products. They're worried about where the chemicals are being used in their neighborhood and how it affects their quality of life. And there's a lot of information out there too as people begin to look more and more at what chemicals are found within us. The number keeps rising. I know that EPA, for example, or excuse me, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, has found upwards of more than 200 chemicals in most people's bodies throughout the United States. There's also impacts to business, increased costs, increased emphasis on brand name. A lot of companies are concerned about their brand name and how presence of toxic chemicals in their products might affect their brand name with consumers. And then, of course, regulations as well. And I'll show a little bit more information on regulations in a bit. And presentations that I've made, I have a lot of slides like this. And I basically pared it down to this one because I think it's a rather telling one. And a cancer panel in 2010 looked at the increase in a lot of childhood diseases over the last 20 to 25, 30 years or so. And they found, for example, a 51% increase in childhood testicular cancer, 55% increase in leukemia, 81% increase in childhood brain cancers. The good news is, even though the incidence of disease has increased, also treatment options have increased. But it sort of shows that there is some problem somewhere in the system. And, we don't know, for example, it's very hard to correlate these increases with specific chemicals or chemical uses. But at least reducing or eliminating the use of toxic chemicals is one thing that we can do, and that if they are contributing to these problems, at least then maybe that's something that we can do to reduce the incidence. But it's quite often the children, the elderly, the susceptible population that are the first ones that show up with these particular types of problems. So, and I do want to show too, I mentioned that a little bit more about chemical regulation, and I like showing this graph because it sort of shows that over the period of time, over the last three, 4, 5 years, a lot of legislation has been passed on specific chemicals. The European Union REACH legislation. There's a lot of information on individual states. Several states have banned flame retardants like polybrominated diphenyl ethers. There's a lot of work going on in Europe and European Union. China, for example, has recently just expanded its chemical legislation and is implementing a similar REACH-like law in China. So it's very clear that, more and more legislation is going out there. Additional substances have been identified. The requirements do vary, and there's sort of a patchwork effect, and I know that there's been a lot of discussion about that. At least REACH and some of those broader legislations do address those issues. But it's often difficult and costly to remove toxic chemicals from products as the regulations expand. And a lot of companies are sort of interested in getting ahead of the curve. So, yes, if we're using a toxic chemical, let's get rid of it. But let's also think about what the alternative is. And is the alternative equivalent or greater toxicity than the chemical we're replacing? And let's try to avoid as much of that as possible. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on as well. There are a lot of advantages to companies to know their toxic chemicals, and avoid hazard.
Folks, it will just be a moment. We're having some audio difficulties. It will just be a moment. Alex is recalling in.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what happened. I've never had a webinar where they've lost me before. So anyway, I'll just continue. I'm sorry about that. I apologize. Hopefully that won't happen again. Let's see. Okay. So moving on, how did companies respond to hazardous chemicals? What they did was basically create restricted substances lists, or RSLs, and they're basically a list of chemicals that companies ban themselves. They make the statement, okay, I don't want any product that contains halogenated flame retardant. So they put it on the list, and then they send that off to their suppliers and make sure that whatever they're getting doesn't contain any of those chemicals of concern. And they get those chemicals from a lot of different areas. You know, there's a lot of authoritative lists out there that say, okay, here are a list of known carcinogens, or here's a list of reproductive toxics, or, you know, that sort of thing. But then there's also quite often customer concerns, so that a customer will say, okay, I don't want products that contain bisphenol A, so that they will put that on their list to eliminate that from their products. And then there's always quite often, industries will decide on certain decisions as an industry-wide thing. So there are a lot of different reasons. There's a lot of variability in RSLs, but there's a lot of examples out there. So I've included a few here from Hewlett-Packard, the apparel industry, and personal care products. I mentioned that the chemicals come from a number of places, authoritative sources. Regulatory requirements are also another source, so that if, for example, you're regulating polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are banned by a number of states throughout the U.S., at least the octa and penta mixtures are, then the companies will put them on their list and say, okay, they're banned, we don't want them. Screening list, consumer, I think I've mentioned a number of these, but the main point out there is there's a lot of variability among the list. There's a lot of things that are out there. The positives is that it does highlight the importance of eliminating or toxic chemicals from products. And it shows a willingness on the part of companies to address some of these issues that have popped up. Some of the big weaknesses, it does not include all chemicals of concern. And it's very hard to keep up to date, so that, a lot of these regulations and lists and sources change sometimes almost on a monthly basis. And I know, for example, that there's been a number of recent additions to California's Proposition 65 list. So, making sure that those additions or deletions are reflected in your RSL can be a problem. The last point, though, the one that's most important, an RSL list will emphasize elimination of a chemical, but what they don't do is ask, okay, what chemical are you using in replacement? And, that's an important point. You need to know not only that you don't have toxic chemicals, but make sure that the replacements are better or safer than the chemicals that you're currently using. And this process is called regrettable substitutions. And a regrettable substitution is basically the replacement of a toxic chemical with a chemical of equal or greater toxicity. It usually happens when chemicals are banned, but there's been no requirement to look at the alternatives, and there's lots of examples out there. And the example that I've included here is in California, when there was a major regulatory effort to get rid of halogenated solvents, which are great in terms of degreasing or in general solvents, a lot of different solvent applications. They eliminated the use of the chlorinated solvents, but what they did is they switched to hexane, and about 5 to 10 years after the switch, all of a sudden workers, and specifically workers in the auto repair industry, started coming down with neurological problems. And when the information had been looked into more detail, it turns out that hexane had been identified as early as the 60s as a neurotoxic chemical. And if somebody had actually asked the question, okay, hexane's a good alternative, but are there any toxicity concerns about it? Perhaps they would not have made that substitution. So one of the big points behind alternatives assessment is to prevent that sort of unfortunate or regrettable substitution. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but I really like the graphic because it sort of shows that it's very easy to, jump from the frying pan into the fire if you don't look at the big picture. So how do you avoid regrettable substitution? You should, start talking to your suppliers and ask about disclosure of chemicals in products. And there's a number of companies that have done that. Seagate, for example, has set up a system where they have identified all chemicals used in all of their products. So if they have any question, they could go to their internal database and get that information. And that's a requirement for doing business with Seagate. You have to provide that information. There's lots of other 7th generation, for example, documents all of the chemicals sold in their products. But one other thing you should consider doing is requiring documentation on, start asking questions. Okay, you've eliminated the use of this toxic chemical. What are you using in its place? And what documentation do you have to show that it's less of a concern? And this is where the alternative assessment field is sort of developing. Hewlett-Packard and a lot of other companies have started to implement alternative assessment processes in their procurement phase of their product formulations, so that they know what's in their product and that they know that when they're getting rid of toxic chemicals, there are improvements. There are also a number of companies that use the more traditional risk assessment process. A lot of companies in the personal care products, and I think there are still some concerns with that, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So safer substitute, the new focus is on alternative assessment. And in case you're wondering what an alternative assessment is, it's a process for identifying and comparing potential chemical and non-chemical alternatives used as substitutes to replace chemicals or technologies of high concern. And I think it's important to emphasize that, it's not only we're using one chemical, let's try to get rid of that chemical. It's also to look in to see if there are any other ways that you can stop using the chemical. So I know in Washington State, for example, when we looked at flame retardants, particularly decobromo-diphenyl ether, potentially used in upholstered furniture, we found that you could actually build upholstered furniture by putting in cloth barriers that eliminated the use or the need for flame retardants. So that was one way that you could actually reformulate or reconstruct the product so that you didn't have to add chemicals to it at all. And that was actually the preferred alternative that we identified for that particular use. Now, chemical hazard assessment is a core part of an alternative assessment, and there are more hours of talks out there that I've done as well on terms of the different components of an alternative assessment. But basically, a hazard assessment just compares the hazard of one chemical or technology with the hazard associated with another chemical alternative or chemical or technology offered up as an alternative. The reason why hazard is used a lot is because it has a major impact on human health or the environment. And by hazard, we mean things like carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, and also environmental toxicity, so what impact it has on non-human species. And also persistence, bioaccumulation, I actually mentioned aquatic toxicity there, but also some other criteria like flammability and explosivity and things like that. I will just mention quickly that there are 8 states currently working on an alternative assessment guidance document. And I will provide some links at the end of this presentation if you're interested in it. In there we can talk about what are the different components of an alternative assessment and how do you do them and how do you construct an alternative assessment, because it's not one tool fits all. There may be varying needs for different applications or products or processes that emphasize some components of an alternative assessment, but those components may not be important for others. So keep that in mind. I do put in there, there are a lot of just some examples of modules: hazard, exposure, cost and availability, performance, life cycle. We've come up with about 9 different modules, so 9 different things that are important components of an alternative assessment. So that's all I'm going to say on that, and we'll move on. I do want to talk about one major benefit. Alternative assessment looks at risk slightly different from a risk assessment process. With an alternative assessment, what we do is what we look at is an optimized risk reduction process, where we basically have a 2-step process where we identify chemicals or processes with the lowest possible hazards, and then you look at those and you further screen them down to see which ones have the lowest exposure potential. So the goal is to select an alternative that has both low hazard and low exposure, and therefore you're optimizing the risk equation. I should comment that, probably most of you know that risk is actually a function of hazard and exposure. So if you have a toxic chemical and there's a huge exposure component to it, those obviously pose the greater risk than a chemical that has a low or no hazard and no exposure. Those are sort of the opposite extremes. Exposure evaluation alone is not used, though, to allow continued use of toxic chemicals, as in our process, both are critical. Now, the benefits for companies, and I've sort of captured a lot of this information from slides from other presentations that have made by companies. So companies like hazard because it's something that they can control. It's based on science, it's very clear, and once you've set up the criteria for comparison, it's very easy to make judgments about which chemicals or processes are better than the others. Whereas exposure is something that's more difficult to quantify. It's quite often made on a lot of assumptions, and experience has shown that we either don't include all possible exposure routes, or some of our assumptions turn out to be more inaccurate than we would like. So if you can emphasize on hazard and select safer chemicals, then using those in products has benefits not only during use, but also throughout the full life cycle of the product. And quite often, a lot of assessments only look at risk associated with a particular use of a product. They don't often look at what exposures and hazards are associated with, manufacture, transport, storage, use, and end of life. So they don't look at all of the components. But the companies also like talking about this process and say, we're providing safer products so that it improves their brand name. Risk assessment, too, is often complicated and expensive, and it's not as easily understood by some of the people within companies making decisions. Quite often companies, the people in companies making decisions like very clear yes and no type responses. And risk assessments don't provide that sort of level of detail. Alternative assessment guidance is how we're getting to that, or alternative assessments, in particular chemical hazard assessments, because they provide the scientific basis and the clear separation between favorable and less favorable alternatives that you can make these decisions upon. Alternative assessments, some people have used the term wave of the future. I'm not quite so optimistic about that, but it is something that continues to grow. It's based on a lot of work that's done by EPA's Design for the Environment. States are adopting it. For example, Maine and Washington both have done alternative assessments using this process. Alternative assessments has also been incorporated in California state regulations. And there's a lot of work that's being done in California on this. California has the broadest, most wide-reaching regulations on alternative assessments. I do want to comment, though, that it is still an evolving process. There's a lot of work that's being done on it. It's going to take some years for it to solidify. But even so, companies are adopting it, and then we are starting to make tools and guidance available, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses that don't always have either the resources or expertise to do that. And that's where the QCAT fits in. So I want to give a little bit of background on the development of tools, and I'll try to make this quick again because I want to get into the meat. A lot of it was based at the same time as the green chemistry principles, where the intent is to make products that are benign by design. So you start at the very beginning when you're thinking about products and implement these 12 principles, and you'll come up with products that you don't have to worry about alternative assessments for, because the products will have been designed to be safe right from the very beginning. The trouble with it, or one limitation, is that there's a lot of products out there that are already being used. So there was a slight process that was needed to deal with existing products. If you're designing a brand new product, green chemistry is the way to go. But if you're dealing with an existing product and you want to make changes, alternative assessment is the process that was used to address the issue of elimination of toxic chemicals. It was primarily based on work that was done by EPA's Design for the Environment program. And they have a voluntary program, and they established 16 toxicity criteria that are used to evaluate alternatives. And they basically really established the alternative assessment process. They're still conducting alternative assessments. There's a number of them going on as we speak. And they also adapted that process to a certification program. So if you're not familiar with it, the Design for the Environment has a product certification program. It started out with cleaning products, but they've got, I think last I checked, was over 2,700 products that have been certified by EPA as safer and preferred. And I should make the comment too that one thing about their certification program, there will still be products in there that are toxic because, for example, if you're trying to do a disinfectant or sell a disinfectant, that's going to be toxic by definition. But the way that EPA approaches that is that they use disinfectants that are not persistent, that are not bioaccumulative, and are used at the lowest possible concentration necessary to do the function. So it's really a very good program, and I highly recommend it if you're interested in any of the products that they've certified. One of the limitations, of course, with EPA's program is that they have access to a lot of resources that we in the rest of the world don't have. So Clean Production Action, an NGO, went out and took the EPA methodology and created what's called the green screen. And they basically adapted the methodology. They established criteria so that you could benchmark chemicals into different degrees of preference, if you will, and then have released that for use. And that is what I have used and a lot of other states have used and companies have used as well to conduct alternative assessments. I do want to show this quickly, and don't worry, I'm not going to go in detail, but one of the advantages of the DFE methodology, the EPA methodology, and the green screen is that you're able to create a nice little table like this, and we actually call this the matrix. So if your name is Neo and you want to know what the matrix looks like, here it is. But it's a very visual tool, and it allows you to sort of evaluate one chemical against another and see what sort of concerns are associated with that particular chemical. And you'll see more of that as well. One of the challenges, though, and one of the things that Clean Production Action did was, how do you handle data gaps? Because there are lots of data gaps out there, and the estimate is that 85% of the chemicals lack complete hazard information. The way Green Screen and EPA gets around it, they do a lot of modeling, they do a lot of professional judgment, etc. But in the end, if the data gaps still exist, they penalize the chemicals for those data gaps, particularly, and they have a hierarchy depending on how important a data gap is. And we are hoping that down the road, with the implementation of the European Union REACH legislation and things like that, more and more data will be made available. And actually, I just came across a really great database that the European Union just released, where they collected a lot of chemical data that was given to them, and they put it in a database, and it's usable by virtually anybody. And there's something like 70,000 chemicals, and data on those chemicals are available in that database. So that's one thing I have to get to the QCAT to update to introduce that new data source into QCAT. So anyway, what is QCAT? Okay, there are a couple of tools that are out there, and I'll go into more detail on each. One is called a list translator, and that's actually the first step in QCAT, is where you actually take chemicals and alternatives and look at them and see if they're on any authoritative lists. And if they're on a list and they've been identified as a problem on the list, it's very easy just to drop them out of consideration. And I'll show you more on that later on. But it's a very good way of dropping out chemicals that you should be avoiding, that aren't preferred. What the QCAT, the Quick Chemical Assessment Tool, is, though, is it takes it a step beyond that sort of authoritative list translator and says, okay, there are a number of databases and sources out there where you can quickly gather some important information, and why not include that in your evaluation as well? And I'll show you examples of how we do that in a few slides. It is important, though, to note that QCAT is actually a stripped-down version of the green screen. And it does a really good job at identifying benchmark 1 chemicals, but it's not really good, or chemicals that get grade F, chemicals that you should avoid. I shouldn't have probably used benchmark 1. I should have said chemicals to avoid. But it does not identify really greener alternatives, because there's a lot of data out there that we may not be looking at. But it's very good at dropping out problems, and I think that's its main advantage. And I know that a lot of companies, I know Hewlett-Packard and a lot of other organizations have used QCAT as a quick screening tool, so that if you have limited resources, you can sort of eliminate all the problem ones and concentrate your resources on the alternatives that need a little bit more review. QCAT is intended to be used by small and medium businesses with limited resources and expertise. And one other advantage I want to point out, it does allow companies to become more familiar with the alternative process. It is available on the web, and the way I've done QCAT, it's about 100 pages, but don't get excited about that because the method itself is only about 20 pages. But what I did do is to go in there and try to do screen captures and say, okay, go to this database, type in information in this way, this page will pop up. Here is the type of information that you need to use in QCAT. So it's meant to be very clearly expletive on how to get information from these different sources. And it's also intended that if you don't know a lot about these databases, you can still use it and get the information that you need. And I'll show some examples there. I think I've talked about a little bit. It is basically a two-step data evaluation process. It's the list comparison, similar to the list translator, and then data from additional sources. And I think I've covered a lot of the negatives and positives. Okay. This is an example of the differences between the green screen and the QCAT in red. So one thing that the QCAT did do is it sort of narrow focused on what parameters or what toxicity criteria are most important. And the criteria that I chose were those that are carcinogenic, mutagenic, or reproductive toxin. If you're in the field, that's called a CMR. Chemicals that are persistent, bioaccumulative, or toxic, PBTs. Chemicals that impact worker health and safety, so that's why I've included acute mammalian toxicity, and then also environmental toxicity, at least an initial screen. So I've included acute aquatic toxicity in QCAT. There are lots of other criteria that green screen looks at, and I'm not trying to say they're not important, but it's just a judgment where we want to concentrate on the worst of the worst, and QCAT was meant to give you the tools to identify the worst of the worst. I've gone through this. One thing that I did want to show, it does show that there are all sorts of flow diagrams throughout it as well to sort of help you evaluate the process. And, it does show, for example, the second blue down on the left says check step 1 sources for information. And, if you find it in the list translator that a chemical has been identified as a problem, say for carcinogenicity or mutagenicity or one of the hazard endpoints that QCAT looks at, there's no reason for you to look any further, because if it's been identified as a carcinogen and a serious enough carcinogen, it doesn't matter what the rest of them it is. It's a problem. You shouldn't be using it. So the process is you do the list translator, you look at all the lists, you eliminate any chemicals that meet the grade F alternate requirements, and I'll explain what those are in a bit. But basically, if a chemical has been proven to be high or very high for any of those criteria, it's probably going to be dropped out. And then, but if you can't find any information on the list for the particular alternative you're looking at, you can then go look at the additional sources. If you find the information that identifies their grade F, then eliminate those from consideration. And then you have a pool that you can select from. And you can say that, at least I made an attempt, and I'll use one of these alternatives with the idea that it's not the perfect one. If you want more guarantee that it is a truly safer, you may want to dedicate some more resources and do a green screen evaluation on the alternatives just to make sure. So I've talked a little bit about the background list, and I'm not going to go in the authoritative list. QCAT does give you links to all of the authoritative lists. So if we talk about propositions, California's Prop 65 list of carcinogens and reproductive toxics, there is a link that takes you directly to that list, and all of them as well. But the advantage is, and some of the new things that are up, is that there are tools that will do that for you. So you don't always have to go to the individual sources. You can go to one of these sources and look at what's called a list translator. There are a number of places that have list translator. There's the Pharaohs database that's created by the Healthy Building Network. They have one. There's also Greenworks, who's a data provider to Walmart. They're doing one. There is also UC Berkeley is developing third-party software portal for accessing List Translator. That's not quite out there yet, but it's there. It will be hopefully available in the future. Pharaohs and Greenworks do cost you money. They're not free. Pharaohs is pretty inexpensive. It's $180 a year. Greenworks is their List Translator is part of their whole package of services, and unfortunately, it's quite a bit more expensive. It's $1,500 a month. So, but if you're a supplier to Walmart, and there's a lot of other companies as well, you have access to that List Translator as part of the Greenworks package. But you can't go and just purchase the List Translator from Greenworks, which I think is a limitation. And I've mentioned it to them. It'd be nice for them to make that as a separate, for a less expensive cost. And maybe they will do that down the road. So I'm going to show you a little bit about Pharaohs. Here's an example of what the database looks like, or what the results look like from Pharaohs. So if you type in a chemical for tetrachloroethylene, or PERC, if you're familiar with it, it's used a lot in dry cleaning, and it's a very good solvent. You can see right away that it has a high hazard for cancer. And the way Pharaohs has done is that they're using the same color coding as the green screen or QCAT does. So if you find, for example, that it's red for cancer, that's probably enough for it to be assigned a grade F in QCAT or a benchmark 1 in green screen and eliminate it from consideration. So it sort of shows you how you can find information for a particular chemical. And it helps you to fill out the matrix as well, and I'll show you how to do that in a bit as well. If we do get time at the end of the presentation, I am sort of hoping to go into Pharaohs and show a live demonstration, but I know that we have a lot to go through and only 20 minutes left, so I won't do it now, but if we do get time, I'll show it at the end. So I talked about it, cost, availability, etc. It goes into a lot of information. I'm not going to go into the details, but it goes into, I'm sorry, these are step 2 sources. So if your chemicals don't show up in the List Translator, you need additional information. And the way QCAT works, there's lots of databases and documents and modeling information out there that you can access. And I'll show you how to do one of those in a few subsequent slides. But QCAT includes the information of how to go to the European Union REACH database and pull out information that might be useful to you to identify chemicals of concern. Here's an example of one of the databases. It's something that EPA has done to identify PBTs. So it documents, for example, on the left here, persistence. So it'll give you the half-life of for this chemical, and it's a decamethylcyclopentasiloxane. It's another alternative that's used in the dry cleaning business, but it'll tell you what the half-life is for that chemical in all of those media, water, soil, sediment, and air. It'll also tell you what the bioaccumulation is, and BCF. It tells you, okay, it has a BCF of 4,200, and BCF stands for bioconcentration factor. And QCAT includes all of what these mean in its demonstration about access. Okay, you have this information now. How do you translate that into, is it a problem or is it not? So one thing that QCAT does, it has something that's called Appendix 8, which is one huge table, and in that it'll break it down by toxicity criteria. So here is part of the table for bioaccumulation. And a lot of the ones you see on the left, the EPA, TRI, PBT, Washington State, those are the authoritative lists. And if they were in there, they would have shown up on the List Translator. But under there, it also has technical criteria. So for bioaccumulation, it says, okay, if it has a BCF or BAF between 1,000 and 5,000, it's a high. So you're able to now fill in the box for bioaccumulation with a high based on the PBT profiler information. And I'll show you how we do that in a bit. So that's how you take the information from the PBT profiler, you look at Appendix 8, you say, okay, where does it fit? Is it very high, high, medium, or low? Based on the technical criteria, you can place it as a high. Now, for the PBT profiler, it also provides information on persistence. And persistence, there's another section, a part of Table 8, that has persistence criteria in it as well. and you can go look at it. And unfortunately, I lost one when I did this slide, so I don't have it for soil. But you can see the arrow for number 1 shows that based on water, it's only a moderate. Based on sediment, it's very high because it has a half-life of SS, which is sediment, greater than 180 days. And for air, it's a high. So what do you do in that situation? You have several different pieces of data, anywhere from moderate to very high. How do you define, or how do you decide what to put in the particular box? In QCAT and in green screen as well, you always default to the most conservative. So for this chemical, persistence would be very high. It's the worst case scenario based on the different media. So then you can go, and this is an example of the matrix table for QCAT. I didn't show you, I didn't put those particular chemicals in because I use this example because it works with subsequent slides. But here, for example, you have far to the right, you have persistence and bioaccumulation. For that chemical, you could list it and put, very high for persistence and high for bioaccumulation. And you can fill in this table using all of the different sources in QCAT. I should comment that we did include all of the things that green screen does not, that we do not look at that are part of green screen, and there's some discussion on whether or not we should keep that in or eliminate that, so that might change down the road. But and DG also identifies a data gap. So you looked at all of the information that's in QCAT, and you couldn't find any information to fill in that box, so you just identify it as a data gap. This is how you then take that table and say, okay, we've got a table that says all of these high, mediums, and lows. How do I decide if it's a grade F, a grade C, a grade B, or a grade A? And you basically start looking at it and say, okay, is it a PBT? Does it have, is persistence high or greater? Is bioaccumulation high or greater? Does it have very high toxicity for acute aquatic or acute mammalian toxicity, or high for the human health criteria? If it has all of those, if it's high B, high P, and meets one of those human health, it's a PBT, therefore it's an automatically grade F. So you only have to meet one of these 5 criteria. You don't have to meet them all, you only have to meet one of them in order for it to be a grade F chemical. Is it very persistent and very bioaccumulative? So is persistence very high and bioaccumulative very high? If it's very high for both, it's a grade F. So you go through those 5. If your table doesn't meet any of those 5, you then go to the next. You look at grade C. If it doesn't meet any of those, you go to grade B. So you basically move up the chart until you find out what grade the chemical has been assigned. So looking at this, though, and I'm not going to go in detail because it adds a level of complexity, but in QCAT, we also do ding chemicals for data gap, and there is a process for evaluating data gaps. And the reason why I use this chemical is that it shows that based on the data that we know, it looks like the chlorinated ones would have an initial grade of C, and the fluorinated would be an initial grade of B. But when you look at the data gaps, there are very important data gaps in the fluorinated compound. We could not find any information on ecological toxicity. So there has been no evaluations that have made about the impact on that chemical on the environment, on anything that's non-human. So what we do in QCAT is that we assign it an F and then give it a subset DG to make it very clear that it is an F solely because that it's missing very important data, where if we were able to fill that in, it might be a B chemical. So it's an incentive for companies if important data is missing to get that data out there so people can do the assessment. But it also prevents you from making a decision about a chemical. So you might have used the fluorinated chemical and then found down the road, a year or two down the road, that it's acutely toxic to the environment and it was a bad choice. We're trying to prevent you from making that bad choice now. We're trying to get you to make the decision based on what data is available. So I'm sorry, that's a really, really quick assessment or example of how QCAT is done. If you're interested, give me a call, look at it online, and I can provide sources where we spend more time going over QCAT and how it's done. There are more examples things like that, so you can get a better idea. This was basically just to provide a quick taste to what QCAT is and what it does for you. So who are using it? One of the things where we're doing here in Washington, we have staff that work with companies who are trying to eliminate the use of toxic chemicals, our pollution prevention staff. We're training them on it so that they can go out and discuss this with their clients and get them to not only eliminate the use of toxic chemicals, but make a better selection when they do. It is being used by consultants. I mentioned that the Pollution Prevention Resource Center is using it and will provide that service for a fee. Companies like Hewlett-Packard were using it as a screening tool, and then the GC3, the Government Commerce and Chemistry Council, is an organization of governments, businesses, and NGOs. They've been doing some alternative assessments, and they've been using it as a screening tool. So the future plan is in the next year work with small and medium businesses to develop some case studies. I also need to go in and update it because I mentioned that there are some new sources. Pharaohs, for example, looked very different when I did the version about a year ago. So I need to go in and update it then. And I also mentioned there are new data sources, new information coming from the European Union, which would make the job easier as well. One thing that we are doing, which is really exciting, is that the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse, which is an association of 9 states and 1 local community to share expertise and resources, we're actually going to start posting in that database QCAT and green screen assessments, so that if the states have done either a QCAT or a green screen on a particular chemical or have paid for someone to do that, we're going to post it. So the advantage to companies is then if you have a chemical and you want to know if any work's been done on it, you can go to our database and then see if somebody's done an assessment on it and potentially use that information to help you make better decisions. We hope to have that up and running within, at least with the first chemicals, in the next 3 to 4 months or so, and then we'll be continually adding to it as we get more work done. So that's a really exciting resource, and oh, by the way, that'll be free. So anybody who has access to the internet will have access to that. Okay, so where do you start as a company? Start asking your supplier about alternatives. Ask your supplier's competition. And then when you're asking about alternatives, ask them, how do you know that alternative is better? Yes, it may be an alternative. Yes, it may be cost effective. And yes, it may be perform. But how do you know it's not going to be a problem for me another year or 2 down the road? What data do you have to show that it's safer than the alternative I'm replacing? One thing you can do too is also start getting training on some of these techniques. We are going to, in the next year, start having training classes on QCAT. Clean Production Action frequently runs classes on the green screen. It's a 1-day class, and it's fairly inexpensive. It's typically under $100 to $150, something like that. We're having one in January, I think it's the 24th, in Minneapolis, and they do travel around the country, so look for them. I do want to point out, too, that alternative assessments is a journey. The way I phrase it is it's great if you can do it and find the best alternative on the first run, but typically if you're using a toxic chemical and you can start moving up the chain and start, not replace it with another grade F chemical, but replace it with something that's a grade C or B or even, if you're lucky enough, A, it's okay to make that step in the short term with the realization that you may want to continue looking at it down the road and continual improvement. Because if you try to go for the perfect chemical, you might find that very, very difficult to do, particularly with the lack of information on chemicals as it's currently available. But so think of it as an incremental improvement process and not something you do once and stop doing. So I mentioned about evaluation, et cetera, et cetera. Conclusions, there's increasing concerns about toxic chemicals, and they're undergoing increasing scrutiny and regulation. Risk assessment tools aren't really adequate for what people are doing in general, and then alternative assessments is what's being developed to address some of those concerns. Companies should know their chemical use, and if you don't know what chemicals are in your products, I think that's the best place for you to start is to start asking about that. And quite often companies will say, okay, I need this widget to do this function, and as long as the widget does the function, they don't often ask, well, what's in that widget? And it might be good for you to start thinking about what is in that widget. And then start investigating tools like QCAT and Green Screen and the list translator that are out there, and see how they might be of use to you and your company. I do have this resource slide, and I won't go into excruciating detail on it. I think that Angela is going to make this presentation available, and so you could go and click. But there's a number of different resources here, including the Pharaohs, the works, and RSLs, and the guidance document that I told you about, etc. So if you're interested in more information, go and check out some of those sources. If you have questions, feel free to give me a call or an email. I should comment that I'm not very good at responding to phone messages. I do respond to them, but it sometimes takes me a while, but I am much better at responding to email. And you can also contact Ken Zarker. I work with Ken, and he's the manager of the group that I work in, and he has a lot of knowledge and information in these areas as well. So I think that's it. I ran a little bit over, but maybe we'll have time for a few questions. And Angela, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Alex. We do have several questions that have come in, and thankfully you've actually been answering quite a few of them, but let's get to some of the others. Do these assessments address functionality of substitutes, or is this a separate assessment? And if so, how does one integrate this element?
That's a very good question. Remember that what I've been talking about here, QCAT is only a chemical hazard assessment, and it's part of the bigger alternative assessment process. In the guidance, we're addressing that to some extent, and typically what we're recommending in our guidance, there are, the 4 steps are things that we think people should do in all alternative assessments. The first one is asking the question, is it necessary? So do we really need that chemical, or can we just eliminate the chemical? And if you can eliminate the chemical either by reformulating your product or redesigning, or in some cases I've examples of people when they started to ask have found that the chemical is not actually needed. So anyway, if you need the chemical, then the next step is to say, okay, what alternatives are out there? Once you've identified what alternatives, typically the next step is, does it function? Does it perform? Because what's the point of looking at anything else if a chemical or an alternative does not function in the product? If you're building a disinfectant, if the chemical doesn't kill what you're trying to disinfect from, it's not going to work. So performance is very important. I should caution, though, that we do take a very broad view of performance, so that there have been examples where companies have said, okay, I can't take this chemical and replace it with this chemical. It won't work in that plastic. But if you actually ask the question, well, can I make slight changes to the plastic that will make that alternative work, you find out that it is possible to make slight changes, to go to a plastic blend, for example, that'll work in the same process and provide the same product with the same benefits, and then the alternative will work in that blend. So we do take sort of a broader perspective. It's not just a one-to-one. We want you to think about it from a broad viewpoint. And then the next thing you do, once you've done performance and eliminated any of the ones that don't perform, that's when you start doing the chemical hazard assessment. So the short answer to the question is performance is very important. It's done early on in the process, and it's something that's external to the chemical hazard assessment. Next question. Hello, did I lose everybody?
I know I'm still here.
Here, next question is the list translator just an area where you get the information to enter into QCAT green screen, or is the list translator a place to go to see if the chemical has met the QCAT green screen criteria?
That's an interesting question. It's a little bit of both, because what you can do is the list translator, it's basically a database that just says, okay, we pulled all these lists together and this is what those lists tell you. So if you did not want to do, you could look at the results from a list translator, and just looking at the list translator, not even, just eliminate it from consideration. I'm not even going to bother to fill in the table for it, because it shows that it's a grade F chemical and it's a waste of my time. So I would just say, okay, I looked at list translator, it's a grade F because it shows that Prop 65 has identified it as a carcinogen. Move on. I wouldn't even bother doing a matrix like that. But if it doesn't have that sort of clear, if it's somewhat questionable, you know, if it doesn't have any reds, if it has a lot of oranges and yellows and things like that, then you definitely want to start filling in a table, because that shows you that the list translator has not clearly identified it as a problem. But you know, for the first step, we want to record that, because if, for example, you find from the list translator that it has information on carcinogenicity and it's been identified as a low probability of causing cancer, you don't really need to look for any more cancer data in the step 2 sources. You've got your answer for cancer. What you're going to look for in the step 2 sources are any boxes that you can't fill in. And that's maybe one thing I didn't mention. The advantage of the two-step process, if you get data from the list translator, there's no reason to look at that anymore in the step 2 sources. Only go to the step 2 sources to fill in data gaps.
We have one last question. Does QCAT require evaluation of transformation products like green screen does?
We recommend it. It's not a requirement as it is under green screen. We always think it's a good idea to look at degradation products, and the example I use is DDT. DDT wasn't really a problem. It was its degradation product DDE that caused all of the environmental impact. So I think it's recommended that you do so, but we understand too that for small and medium businesses that might be a more of an issue. So it's not an absolute requirement under QCAT as it is under green screen. However, you know, if you are able to limit yours down and you do want to do a more thorough evaluation of those select few, and you're thinking of doing a green screen, then degradation products would be important to include.
Thank you, Alex.
Okay.
Cindy?
Yes, I would like to thank Alex Stone for giving us this overview of QCAT and all the examples, the folks who are using it, how it compares to some of the other tools. All very excellent, Alex. Thank you very much. Alex, again, is from the Washington Department of Ecology, and the webinar will be posted online along with the slides in the near future. And I want to remind folks to please complete the survey following the webinar. That's very helpful to help us make improvements. And then the slide that's up now are some upcoming events related to green chemistry and the Safer Chemistry Challenge program. As Alex mentioned, there will be a green screen training in Minneapolis. Alex does come to some of the green screen trainings or is part of them with the QCAT, but this one he may or may not be able to attend this particular one. It's on January 24th, and that green screen training will be followed immediately on Friday, January 25th by the Minnesota Green Chemistry Conference called Beakers to Business Plans. Both of those, I believe, will be held at the University of Minnesota campus, so we'll be putting out more information on that, and there is already a registration page available. We have our upcoming Spring 2013 webinar series, which is being planned, and the first one will likely be the beginning of February there. So please we'll wrap up by saying to please check out our website at p2.org/challenge, Safer Chemistry Challenge Program. Use the technical assistance resources that are available to you through the Safer Chemistry Challenge Program, and contact us with any questions that you might have at saferchemistry@gmail.com. Thanks very much for listening today.
Thank you.